Hamad Fadl, University of Toronto, Faculty of Law. Thank you, Kecia, for your lecture. One, I think, very, very crucial question that I have. You've essentially accused the Academy, male scholars, of having arbitrary standards of excellence for inclusion of scholarship worthy of consideration. Now, I think we would agree, you and me, that there are certain kinds of skills that are absolutely indispensable for engaging in early Islamic legal history, let's say. So, I mean, I would really be interested in having some concrete examples where you think some work has been dismissed on arbitrary grounds. And then, if you could articulate more theoretically what you consider the standards of excellence to be that every scholar, male or female, Muslim or non-Muslim, should have. And why we don't just follow that rigorously in our graduate programs.
So it's a great question because it illustrates, I think, a number of the dynamics that I've been discussing. The problem of formulation of standards is precisely a gendered problem. The criteria for which projects are worthy and what skills are needed to carry them out is going to differ depending on what kind of project one is doing. If you're doing a study of a classical Muslim legal text, you need to read Arabic. Okay, I think we can agree on that. But do you need to have read that text with a Hanafi scholar who has a chain of authorities, who comes through a particular, or is it okay if you read it with your graduate advisor, right? I mean, I think it's an impossible question framed in a way that presumes that there's a very straightforward answer, but wants to say, well, if you can't come up with that answer, then your critique is invalid.
But nobody in the academy would say that you haven't studied the Hanafi, so you're not qualified, right?
I don't think that that is in fact an accurate statement. I think, well, maybe, you know, but you haven't studied with the Shafi'is, so you're not qualified. I mean, I think, right? I mean, I think that this is really a problem. I think that this is really a problem, and I think that it's really cute that you think that a list of standards of excellence would solve this for us, but that's not where it's going to be solved. You know, that's just not. I just don't even know how to answer that particular question.
Assalamu alaikum and good evening, Dr. Ali. Thank you for this excellent lecture. And also, I realize as you're speaking towards the end of this discussion that really at the core is the issue of viability of women, which is one aspect of the objectification of women. And I'm wondering if you can talk more about that, because you said women's ideas can be taken, and this is the same kinds of boundary violations that happen in sexual harassment and rape. So the boundaries of women, both intellectually and physically, are violated. They are viable rather than inviolable. Inviolable. So would you comment further on that? And thank you again.
Thank you. I think that's a really wonderful question about boundaries, because I've heard two Arab men give presentations at two different conferences that basically recapitulated the argument of sexual ethics and Islam without mentioning me once, and then went on to make some corrections. Now, ideas come to be part of a zeitgeist. I get that. And in some ways, the biggest compliment to a scholar is that their ideas become conventional wisdom. But a book that I published 10 years ago that some people are refusing to read, and other people read and teach but don't cite in their own work, is not that kind of a work, right? I mean, perhaps you could make a plausible case for Amina Wadud's ideas about egalitarian creation as having occasioned that shift. And that's perhaps a reasonable reason for, say, a leader of the Islamic Society of North America to talk about egalitarian creation in an interfaith context in a way that assumes the work she's done and doesn't cite it. But when it shows up in a scholarly narrative, then that's not okay. And it's not okay for a book that treats Amina Wadud as an American interpreter of the Quran not to cite in that chapter any of the work that women scholars have done on Wadud's Quran interpretation. It's just not okay. And so I think that question of violability, right? It's a larger question. It's a question about women's ideas. Of course, it's actually really a question about women's bodies. And insofar as it's a question about women's bodies, it's a raced question in America. It's a question about social location and class. And you know, it's a question that we confront with boundary violations large and small. And I would be willing to bet that every woman in this room has had plenty of instances where they have to decide if defending a particular boundary is worth the hassle, right? And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't.
Kecia Ali, thank you so much for your talk, and thank you for 20 years of extraordinary work to elevate the standards of the field at the AUR and elsewhere. My question is actually very simple, which is about mentorship. I think those of us who watch you and learn with you and learn from you, almost every time we see you at the AAR, you are around people, you're mentoring people who are coming into the field and giving feedback to people, correcting dissertations and all of that. Can you share with us some best practices that you found that you think can help create this collegial culture of mentorship? And to follow along what you've been talking with us about, how do we do that without that burden of mentorship also disproportionately falling on the very female faculty that you've been talking about already being overburdened?
It's a great question, and the answer is you do more of it, right? I mean, you line edit the dissertation drafts, right? You have those phone calls, you do the things that need to be done. And you say to your students, male and female, is there a gender angle here? Right? You say to your students, are you citing these scholars? Why not? Right? And when you get a book to blurb from a publisher, this goes beyond mentoring, but it goes to best practices, you look at the book, and if the book doesn't, if it omits to cite women who are very clearly germane to the topic, you point it out. Mentoring is one of the best things that we get to do as professors in the academy. And feminist mentoring, right, is mentoring not just of women, right? I think the most important kind of feminist mentoring that we do with male scholars is, not that the mentoring we do of male scholars is the most important feminist mentoring, I don't mean that. I mean that the important feminist mentoring of male scholars is not about making them feel bad to be men, right? I want to be very, very clear about that. But it's about helping them become aware of things that, because they are men in the academy, they may not perceive as realities. And probably nobody ever suggested to them that they need to think about women, women's ideas, women thinkers, women's books. For women, it becomes part of the conversation, particularly where there is a cohesive group of women scholars. It's an obvious thing for us to talk about. And so, for both men and women mentoring men, bring it up explicitly. It's not hard.